let's jump in. So what is the delivery bill of materials? So when we think about the delivery bill, it's really a comprehensive accounting of all of the security, compliance, and validation checks and actions that are taken in association with a given software deployment. So really, it's looking at all the things that have gone on, not just the contents, which is going to be our SBOM, right? But all the things that have taken place from the moment that code is checked in and the checks that it goes through there, through the build process, and then once the artifacts are generated, sort of what checks happen there, and then ultimately into the deployment stage, and ultimately what checks go on at that phase, right? So if we think about this, you can take these four categories, and some might argue, and we're talking about it internally as well, if test and QA need its own, and we've sort of put some of that in here as we sort of refine the definition of this. But I think we've settled on, for an initial piece here, these four stages, and really sort of documenting what goes on during these four stages. So as some examples, looking at source code, and we'll actually see a live example of this as we walk through some of the mock-ups and some of the screen captures that I've taken in the product. But any of the dynamic or static code analysis checks, things like branch protection and validation, code review validation, when we think about source code. Now, the system that's generating this bill of materials, or this delivery bill of materials, doesn't have to perform these checks, but it does have to integrate with the systems that are performing these checks to be able to understand what those results were, and ultimately catalog those results and determine whether or not the policies that are being enforced, or the rules engine allows for the results of those things to allow the build to move forward. When we look at things like build validation, we need to tie into the build system, CI validation, and unit test coverage validation. So the types of things that happen within the build system, we want to make sure that we're capturing and documenting as part of that delivery bill of materials. Artifact validation. So we start getting into dependency checks, right? And sort of the efficacy of some of the dependencies that were brought in. Have they changed since the last deployment? And then ultimately vulnerability assessments. So as we look at an artifact and look at scanning that artifact, or bringing in data from tools like Sneak or others that will do these scans, and ultimately make an assessment and document the vulnerability assessment to make sure that, again, the ultimate goal here is to be able to bump this up against a set of rules to determine whether or not this is fit for distribution or fit for deployment. And then, when we do things like deployment validations, looking at things like sys benchmark checks, deployment performance validation. So for those of you that are doing things like canary releases, or want to go ahead and actually make sure that, this system is tied into something like Prometheus or Datadog, as you've done that initial deployment, you want to make sure that it's performing the way it's supposed to. So you're doing things like log analysis to determine whether or not there are any errors or any problems with that particular deployment. And then approval validation. So what mechanism was used to actually obtain approvals, and were those approvals manual, were they automated, but documenting those approvals as part of that deploy stage. So again, when we think about what that delivery bill of materials is, it's really an accumulation of all of this data to sort of represent the efficacy of this given deployment that's going to go out. Now, again, the challenge here, and we'll talk a little bit later in the presentation about this, is how do I do this at scale? How do I do this to make sure that when I'm going to do a release, that this stuff's being accumulated and assessed, and the building out of this bill of materials is happening automatically. Doing this, obviously, from a manual perspective, would be really difficult, right? It would require a lot of data consolidation that would have to happen manually. So again, just that overview of sort of what this is what I wanted to accomplish on this slide, and that's our baseline for the rest of our presentation. All right, so let me just, there we go. The delivery bill of materials versus the software bill of materials. So this is something that we get all the time, right? So in, the title of this is going beyond the software bill of materials. I personally am a believer in the fact that these things need to coexist, right? You need to have a software bill of materials, especially this day and age where so much open source is being brought in. There's an efficiency in terms of development to make sure that you're writing code that is required for your application, and then libraries that are needed to actually facilitate that can be, that are already out in the open source community can be brought in. However, getting to a place where you have that comprehensive software bill of materials is sort of phase one of the approach, right? Because now you sort of know of the things and of the dependencies and of the bits that are being brought in, what their status is, right? Who the publisher was, how is it licensed? Is it a verified or known source? Are there vulnerabilities associated with it? Now, what we are suggesting is that gets folded into and made part of the delivery bill of materials. So, and again, if you think what we're doing here, we're just widening the aperture of our scope to look at the entire deployment, right? We're not just looking at the tactical and saying, what are the packages that make up this deployment? And we're also not suggesting that that's not important. It's also in conjunction with that, let's widen the aperture of our scope. Let's look at multifaceted checks, both software and environment. Let's focus on all the elements of deployment. Let's focus on, the source code, the compiling and the CI along with the unit tests, the artifact scanning and the artifact assessments, and then ultimately that deployment methodology and that deployment environment. So again, I think if we look at this and we say, hey, the software bill of materials fits into that either source or artifact reporting, and that check can happen. That check is vital, right? But that check can happen and then ultimately gets folded into that delivery bill of materials. Again, giving us a much more comprehensive view of this thing from, as it relates to going from the fingertips of your software engineers all the way out through the deployment, right? So I think, the idea behind this is we're also introducing this concept that security and validation doesn't stop at the code check-in, right? It's those shift left policies in terms of security and implementing secure coding practices, all are things that are hyper important these days. But again, I think what we're suggesting here is through the delivery bill of materials, you're going to want or expect or need visibility beyond just what happens at that development phase. And so this is really what we're attempting to introduce here as we walk through sort of looking at that entire process end to end.